Aja Wilson should have been celebrating. A historic honor, a legacy-defining moment. The kind of recognition athletes dream about when they first pick up a ball. Time magazine naming her 2025 Athlete of the Year wasn't just another award. It was a stamp on a career already packed with championships, MVPs, and dominance that few in WNBA history can touch. This was supposed to be a victory lap, a moment to reflect on how far she'd come and where the league was headed next. But instead of feeling like a celebration, the moment landed with tension. Because buried inside that glowing profile was a single line that instantly shifted the mood. A phrase that didn't praise the future, didn't unite the league, and didn't stay focused on the achievement at hand. WNBA history was erased for a minute. 7 words that fans immediately latched onto. Not because they were vague, but because they felt pointed, and almost everyone watching knew exactly who they were about. The timing is what made it impossible to ignore. This wasn't said in the heat of competition. It wasn't part of an emotional post-game rant or a locker room soundbite taken out of context. This came during the biggest media spotlight of Wilson's career, a carefully crafted feature meant to celebrate excellence. And that's why it hit differently. When you're standing at the top of the mountain, every word carries weight, especially when the league is still navigating the aftershocks of Caitlin Clark's arrival. For months, fans had been saying something felt off. The way Clark was treated during her rookie season, the physical play, the silence from veterans, the subtle tension that never quite got addressed publicly. Most of it lived online, in comment sections and debate shows, brushed off as fan noise or social media overreaction. But that single sentence in Time magazine made those whispers feel a lot louder. Because here's the thing, nobody forced this moment to become controversial. Wilson could have kept the focus entirely on her accomplishments, on winning, on dominance, on legacy. Instead, the narrative cracked open a deeper conversation about recognition, control, and who gets to define the story of women's basketball moving forward. And once that door opened, it couldn't be closed. What makes this even more fascinating is what happened next, or rather who spoke next. Because for all the speculation, all the anticipation, and all the expectation of fireworks, Caitlin Clark didn't respond the way anyone predicted. No clapback, no subtle shade, no carefully worded rebuttal through sources close to the situation. What she did instead caught the entire basketball world off guard, and in doing so, revealed a contrast that goes far beyond awards or stats. This isn't just about one comment in a magazine interview. It's about 2 completely different approaches to leadership, 2 visions of what growing the game actually means, and a moment that exposed the fault line between protecting the past and building the future. The reaction didn't start with outrage, it started with confusion. Aja Wilson's Time magazine interview was supposed to be polished, celebratory, and reflective, the kind of profile where every word is weighed carefully. So when she said that WNBA history was erased for a minute, it immediately stood out. Not because it was loud or aggressive, but because it didn't belong to the moment she was in. It felt like a sentence pulled from a completely different conversation. Fans didn't need names spelled out to understand the implication. The league hadn't forgotten its history during some random stretch of games or a quiet off-season. The only minute that made sense was the explosion of attention surrounding Caitlin Clark's rookie season, a period when women's basketball dominated headlines in ways it never had before. Attendance records fell, ratings spiked. The mainstream sports world, which had long ignored the WNBA, suddenly couldn't look away. That was the moment Wilson's comments seemed to point toward. What made the line so combustible wasn't just what it suggested, but how calmly it was delivered. There was no emotional edge, no obvious bitterness.
That restraint made it feel intentional, carefully phrased, as if it were meant to land without sounding like an attack, while still planting a clear idea in the reader's mind. The message wasn't shouted, it was implied, and implied messages often travel farther than direct ones. Timing amplified everything. Wilson didn't say this during Clark's rookie year, when emotions were high and debates were raging. She waited. The comment came after the dust had settled, after Clark had already secured her place as the league's most visible star, and after Wilson herself had reclaimed center stage with Time's highest individual honor. That delay changed how the words were received. It felt less like a reaction and more like a statement, one made from a position of power.
Almost immediately, the conversation shifted. Social media dissected the quote. Analysts replayed it. Fans debated whether it was fair or unnecessary. Some defended Wilson, arguing she was standing up for the players who built the league before the spotlight arrived. Others saw it as a subtle attempt to minimize Clark's impact without naming her directly. And that divide is exactly why the line lit the fuse. It forced people to pick a side, even if they didn't want to. Because once you suggest that history was erased, you're not just commenting on media coverage, you're questioning whose contributions matter most. You're drawing a line between legacy and momentum. And whether Wilson intended it or not, that single sentence reframed her entire interview, turning a celebration of greatness into the opening chapter of a much larger conflict. And the deeper people looked at it, the harder it became to believe the words were accidental. To understand why that line hit so hard, you have to understand what Caitlin Clark actually changed, not in theory, not in hype, but in reality. Her rookie season didn't just produce highlights or box score numbers, it shifted the gravity of the entire league. The WNBA didn't slowly grow into a bigger spotlight, it snapped into one almost overnight, and Clark was at the center of it. Arenas that had struggled with attendance for years were suddenly selling out days in advance. Road games felt like home crowds because fans showed up wearing her jersey in opposing cities. Television networks adjusted programming on the fly, moving fever games into prime slots because the numbers demanded it. This wasn't the usual interest bump that comes with a promising rookie. It was a full-blown surge that pulled casual fans, college basketball viewers, and even people who hadn't watched women's basketball before into the conversation. The most important part is that this attention didn't replace the league's past, it exposed it. Millions of new viewers were introduced to players they'd never seen before. They learned about rivalries, dynasties, and stars who had been dominating long before Clark arrived. But the entry point was different this time. Clark wasn't just another great player, she was a gateway. The kind that makes people stop scrolling, turn on the TV, and actually stay. And that kind of influence doesn't come from awards or league promotions, it comes from cultural pull. Clark crossed out of the basketball bubble in a way few players ever have. Her highlights traveled faster than official marketing campaigns. Her name carried weight in spaces the WNBA had struggled to access for decades. Suddenly, the league wasn't fighting for attention, it was responding to demand. That shift is what unsettled people. Because when the spotlight moves that quickly, it can feel like everything before it is being pushed aside, even if it isn't. Longtime stars were still winning, teams were still competing, history was still intact, but the conversation had a new center. And when attention becomes currency, losing control of it can feel like losing relevance. Clark didn't ask for that role. She didn't campaign for it or claim ownership over it. It happened because fans decided she was must-watch, and once that decision was made, there was no slowing it down. The league was suddenly growing in directions that couldn't be carefully managed or evenly distributed. It was raw, chaotic, and impossible to ignore. That's why the phrase "erased for a minute" struck a nerve, because nothing was erased, it was overshadowed by momentum, and momentum doesn't negotiate. It doesn't wait its turn. It simply moves forward, forcing everyone around it to adjust. And for the first time in a long time, the WNBA wasn't being introduced through its history, it was being introduced through its future. What made the tension linger wasn't just what was said later, it was what wasn't said at the time. During Caitlin Clark's record-breaking rookie season, one thing stood out to fans paying close attention: the silence. Not league-wide silence, but the quiet absence of acknowledgement from some of the WNBA's most established voices. And among them, A'ja Wilson's name came up again and again. Clark's first year wasn't a smooth rise. It was loud, chaotic, and at times uncomfortable. She faced sold-out crowds on the road that felt more hostile than welcoming. The physicality was relentless, often crossing into territory that sparked non-stop debate. Online noise followed her everywhere, including moments when things clearly went too far. Through all of that, fans expected veteran leadership to step in, not to protect her, but to steady the moment, to remind everyone what the league stood for as it entered uncharted territory. But that reassurance never really came.
Wilson, widely viewed as one of the league's leaders and most respected figures, stayed publicly quiet. No congratulatory posts when records fell, no acknowledgement when Clark was unanimously named Rookie of the Year, no visible support when the attention became overwhelming. It wasn't an obligation, nobody is required to celebrate another player, but leadership carries expectations, and the absence of even a neutral acknowledgement began to feel noticeable as the season went on. Silence has a way of speaking on its own, especially when it stretches across milestone after milestone. Clark wasn't just having a good rookie year, she was reshaping how the league was being consumed. Every week brought a new headline, a new record, a new wave of eyes on women's basketball. And while many players embraced the moment, others watched from a distance. That distance became part of the story. Fans started asking questions, not accusations, just questions. Why avoid the moment? Why wait it out? Why let the conversation grow without offering any clarity? The longer the silence lasted, the harder it became to believe it was accidental. It felt deliberate, even if no explanation was ever offered. That's why Wilson's later comment landed so differently. When someone stays quiet during the storm, but speaks once the spotlight shifts back in their favor, people notice. The silence during Clark's rise, followed by reflection only after recognition was secured, created a narrative Wilson never directly addressed, but also never corrected. And once that pattern became visible, it reframed everything that followed. The comment in Time magazine didn't arrive in isolation. It arrived at the end of months of unanswered moments. Moments where leadership could have been shown, bridges could have been built, and the league could have presented a united front during its most explosive growth phase. Instead, the quiet lingered, and when it finally broke, it did more damage than anyone expected. Once fans started connecting the dots, a pattern became impossible to ignore. The criticism surrounding Caitlin Clark in 2024 was never just about basketball. It was about attention. Who received it, how much of it, and whether one player should ever become bigger than the league itself. That argument came up repeatedly during Clark's rookie season, often framed as concern for fairness and respect for the players who had built the WNBA long before the spotlight arrived. A'ja Wilson was part of that conversation, not always directly, but clearly enough for people to remember. The message was consistent. Individual recognition had gone too far. The focus on one player was framed as divisive. Clark's rise, some said, risked overshadowing the collective effort that made the league what it was. The implication was that celebrating one star too loudly came at the expense of everyone else. At the time, those arguments found support. They sounded principled, protective, grounded in the idea that women's basketball should move forward together rather than revolve around a single name. Fans were told this was about balance, about honoring history, about making sure credit was shared. Then 2025 arrived. Time magazine didn't put the WNBA on its cover.
It didn't spotlight a team. It didn't frame the honor as a collective achievement. It chose one athlete, A'ja Wilson, and centered the entire narrative around her accomplishments, her dominance, her legacy. A solo cover, a singular spotlight, the very kind of recognition that had been criticized just months earlier when Clark received it. And suddenly, the objections disappeared. There were no public calls to include Wilson's teammates, no reminders that championships are won as a group, no statements about how focusing on one player might distort the league's history. The same voices that argued against individual stardom fell quiet when the attention shifted in a different direction. Fans noticed, and once you notice a double standard, it's impossible to unsee it. This wasn't about whether Wilson deserved the honor. Her resume speaks for itself. The issue was consistency. If individual recognition was truly the problem, then the standard should apply no matter who's standing in the spotlight. But the rules seemed to change depending on who benefited from them. That realization reshaped the entire debate. It suggested that the resistance to Clark's recognition was never really about principle. It was about control, about who gets to be the face of the league and when. When Clark held that position, the spotlight was framed as dangerous. When Wilson stepped into it, the spotlight became earned and appropriate.
And that contradiction fueled the frustration, because fans weren't asking for one star to be diminished in favor of another. They were asking for honesty. If the league truly believed in shared credit, then it had to live by that standard even when it was inconvenient. And when it didn't, it confirmed what many suspected all along. The issue wasn't the spotlight itself, it was who the spotlight belonged to. At a certain point, the conversation stopped being emotional and started becoming mathematical. Opinions could be debated, narratives could be spun, but the numbers told a story that was impossible to soften. Caitlin Clark's arrival didn't just shift attention, it shifted leverage. And in professional sports, leverage changes everything. During her rookie season, the league saw jumps that couldn't be explained away as coincidence. Games featuring Clark didn't just perform better, they performed on a different scale. Television audiences multiplied, networks adjusted schedules because the data demanded it. Sponsors didn't wait to be convinced, they followed the traffic. Merchandise moved at rates the league hadn't experienced before, with Clark's jersey becoming a symbol that reached far beyond basketball fans. This wasn't about one player being better than another on the court, it was about market gravity. Wherever Clark went, the numbers followed. Attendance rose, engagement spiked, media coverage expanded, and when patterns repeat across cities, platforms, and demographics, they stop being hype and start becoming infrastructure. That shift created an uncomfortable reality for the league's established hierarchy. For years, power in the WNBA had been defined by championships, MVPs, and internal respect. Wilson checked every one of those boxes. Her resume was built the traditional way: dominance over time, success within the system, recognition from those already invested in the sport. Clark disrupted that model by adding an external force: mass audience demand. And mass demand doesn't wait its turn. In a single season, Clark generated the kind of visibility that takes most athletes an entire career to reach, if they ever reach it at all. That visibility translated into influence, not because she asked for it, but because the league suddenly depended on it. Broadcasters wanted her games, sponsors wanted her image, fans wanted access. The ecosystem adjusted around her, not the other way around. That's where the tension deepened, because when numbers start dictating decisions, legacy alone isn't enough to maintain control. Wilson's accomplishments remained undeniable, but the center of gravity had shifted. The league was no longer growing in a straight line, it was expanding outward, pulled by a force it didn't fully anticipate. For players who had spent years building the foundation, that change felt destabilizing. It raised questions no one wanted to answer out loud. Who defines success now? Who represents the league to the outside world? And what happens when the future arrives faster than the past can adapt? Those questions sat underneath every comment, every silence, and every carefully chosen word. The numbers didn't just elevate Clark, they rewrote the power dynamic. And once that happened, the conversation was never going to stay purely about basketball again. By the time Caitlin Clark finally responded, the pressure was enormous. Fans had dissected every word of A'ja Wilson's interview. Sports media waited for a reaction, expecting tension, maybe even a carefully veiled counterpunch. In a moment like that, silence can feel like surrender, and speaking up can feel like gasoline. Everyone assumed Clark would choose one or the other. She chose neither. There was no statement, no interview, no long explanation designed to control the narrative. Instead, Clark did something so simple it caught everyone off guard. She congratulated A'ja Wilson, publicly, clearly, without qualifiers or subtext. No clever wording, no indirect references, just respect. That single post landed harder than any rebuttal ever could have. Because it didn't challenge Wilson's words, it exposed them. While A'ja Wilson used her biggest career platform to look backward and question how the league's story was being told, Clark used hers to look forward and lift someone else up. The contrast was immediate, and it was impossible to spin. What made the moment even more powerful was the timing. Caitlin Clark didn't wait for the controversy to fade. She didn't let fans fight the battle for her. She stepped in at the exact moment when escalation would have been easy and restraint would have been difficult. And she chose restraint anyway. That decision reframed the entire situation in seconds. There was no sarcasm in her message, no passive phrasing that left room for interpretation. She highlighted Wilson's season, she acknowledged the achievement, and she moved on. In doing so, Clark removed herself from the drama entirely and left it hanging in the air for everyone else to examine.
That's why fans started calling it a power move, not because it was aggressive, but because it was controlled. Clark understood something crucial. Responding with grace doesn't weaken your position when the audience already sees the contrast, it strengthens it. Her response didn't ask for validation, it earned it. In that moment, the narrative flipped. The conversation stopped being about whether Wilson's words were justified and started being about how differently the two players approached leadership. One framed success as something that could be threatened. The other treated it as something that could be shared. Clark's silence before the post, followed by a single intentional gesture, said more than 1,000 defensive statements ever could. She didn't argue for her place in the league. She acted like she already belonged. And that quiet confidence is what made the moment resonate far beyond basketball. Once the dust settled, the situation stopped being about one comment or one response. It became about philosophy. Two different ways of viewing success, legacy, and what it actually means to grow a league that's finally breaking into the mainstream. And in that contrast, the divide couldn't have been clearer. A'ja Wilson represents a model built on protection. Protection of history, protection of hierarchy, protection of what was earned when attention was scarce and recognition had to be fought for inch by inch. In that framework, the spotlight is something that must be managed carefully, parceled out with intention, and guarded against overwhelming the foundation that came before it. From that perspective, Clark's sudden rise doesn't just feel disruptive, it feels destabilizing. Caitlin Clark operates from a completely different place. Her approach is rooted in expansion. More eyes don't take away from the game, they add to it. More coverage doesn't erase history, it introduces it to people who never knew it existed. She doesn't treat success like a limited resource that must be defended. She treats it like momentum that grows when it's shared. Neither philosophy is born out of malice. One is shaped by scarcity, the other by opportunity. Wilson came up in a league that constantly had to justify its value, where every ounce of recognition felt fragile. Clark entered at a moment when the sport was finally ready to explode, when the infrastructure was waiting for a spark. That difference in experience shapes everything: how players react to attention, how they interpret change, and how they define leadership. The problem is that both philosophies now exist in the same league at the same time, colliding in real time. And moments like this expose that tension.
When Wilson speaks about protecting history, she's really speaking about preserving meaning. When Clark responds with generosity, she's signaling confidence in the future. One looks back to ensure nothing is lost. The other looks forward, trusting that growth will carry everyone with it. Fans feel that difference instinctively. It's why reactions were so polarized. Some saw Wilson as defending the soul of the league. Others saw Clark as embodying its evolution. But what's impossible to ignore is which approach aligns with where the WNBA is heading, not where it's been.
This isn't about choosing sides. It's about recognizing that the league is at a crossroads. The next era won't be defined by who deserves credit. It will be defined by who knows how to handle attention without fear of losing relevance. And in that sense, this moment wasn't a clash between two players. It was a glimpse into the growing pains of a league learning how to live in the spotlight. In the end, this moment didn't need a winner. It revealed one. A'ja Wilson will go down as one of the greatest players the WNBA has ever seen. Nothing about this situation changes her resume, her dominance, or what she's earned on the court. But legacy isn't shaped only by trophies. It's shaped by how leaders respond when the ground shifts beneath them. And this was one of those moments when the shift was impossible to deny. Caitlin Clark didn't argue her place in the league. She didn't demand acknowledgement or push back against perceived slights. She simply kept moving forward. While others debated what her rise meant, she showed what it looked like in practice: respect without insecurity, confidence without defensiveness, and leadership without control. That's why her response resonated so deeply. It didn't feel strategic, it felt natural. The future rarely announces itself through conflict. It arrives through behavior, through patterns that repeat, through moments where one person escalates and another de-escalates, and the audience instinctively knows which direction feels right. Clark understood that the league doesn't grow by fighting over attention. It grows when attention becomes big enough for everyone. This isn't about erasing history or rewriting it. The WNBA's past matters. The players who built it matter. But the future belongs to those who know how to carry that history forward without guarding it like a fragile possession. Growth doesn't ask for permission, and it doesn't wait for consensus. It moves. What this moment ultimately showed is that relevance isn't protected by pointing backward. It's secured by stepping into what's next. The players who will define the league's next chapter won't be the ones arguing about who deserves the spotlight. They'll be the ones who understand how to use it. And that's why this story lingers, not because of a quote or a post or a controversy, but because it quietly answered a much bigger question. When the spotlight gets brighter, who rises with it and who resists it?